morning to everyone joining us from Japan, and good evening for those of you joining us from the United States and elsewhere across the world. My name is Sam Barron. I'm a research fellow here at YCAPS, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Today, we're truly honored and thrilled to host Ambassador Scot Marciel for a special talk about his latest book entitled Imperfect Partners, the United States and Southeast Asia. Although Ambassador Marciel really needs no introduction, I'll provide one anyway. Currently, Ambassador Marciel is serving as the Oksenberg-Rohlen Fellow at Stanford University's Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and concurrent to that, he is also a senior advisor at Ballard Group Asia, a business advisory firm focused on the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Marciel retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in April 2022 after a 37-year career that included assignments as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar, Ambassador to Indonesia, and Ambassador for ASEAN Affairs. He also served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and in U.S. missions in the Philippines, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Turkey, and Brazil. A native of Fremont, California, he holds an MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a BA from the University of California, Davis. We're so lucky to have one of America's greatest Southeast Asia hands, or as Ambassador Marciel calls himself in the book, a Southeast Asia aficionado, to discuss Imperfect Partners, which is really an important publication that combines substantial research and analysis on U.S. foreign policy towards Southeast Asia since the end of World War II to the present, with illuminating anecdotes about Ambassador Marciel's distinguished career throughout the region as a U.S. Foreign Service officer. For those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, either during or after the talk, I'll be sending out a link to the page on Amazon in the chat below shortly. A few housekeeping notes about the structure of the talk before we begin. First, I'll hand over the floor to Ambassador Marciel, who will provide a brief introduction to his book and highlight some of the key big picture points on trends on Southeast Asia policy over the past 50 years. Following his open remarks, Scot and I will then delve into a conversation that will touch upon some of the modern day policy challenges in the ASEAN states that he mentions in the book, also leaving a bit of time to discuss some of his experience living and working in the Philippines, Vietnam, and elsewhere across the region. Once we conclude our discussion, I'll then open the floor to the audience for the Q&A session. Anytime throughout the talk, please feel free to type any questions you may have for Ambassador Marciel into the chat, and we will try to get to them in due course. One last reminder before I hand over the floor to Ambassador Marciel is that this event is on the record and will be recorded and uploaded to the official YCAPS YouTube channel. So please keep that in mind as we begin. So with that, over to you, Scot. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sam, and to YCAPS for giving me a chance to talk about my book and about Southeast Asia. It's actually great timing. I'm not sure that you planned it this way, but this week with the various ASEAN and ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit meetings being held in Indonesia, tomorrow the Thai Parliament voting on Prime Minister, which is always interesting, but particularly interesting this year. In the middle of this horrific Myanmar crisis, lots going on in the South China Sea. So a great time again to talk about Southeast Asia. And as you said, the book I wrote discusses U.S. relations with Southeast Asia over the last decades and provides some recommendations on strengthening them. It's based in part on my own experience in the region, but also quite a bit of research. So it's not at all a memoir. A lot of the book traces the ups and downs of the various U.S. relationships in the region, and it does focus on the countries where I served or spent significant time: the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and then of course lots of work with ASEAN itself. And what I'll do in this brief introduction is just kind of highlight what I thought were some of the key points. One, and people who follow Southeast Asia, I think will understand this, the fact that at least in the United States, Southeast Asia's importance is often underappreciated, at least these days. In the 60s and the 70s, the United States was really focused on Southeast Asia, maybe too much, some would say. Obviously, with the Vietnam War, Laos, Cambodia, etc., it was really the central front or a central front in the broader Cold War, where our alliances with Thailand and the Philippines were critical. And we looked at pretty much everything that happened in Southeast Asia through that Cold War prism. And even after the Vietnam War, this was true in the 1980s. For example, we looked at Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia through that Cold War lens. But then after the Cold War, the U.S. lost that strategic prism through which it viewed Southeast Asia. And I argue in the book that Southeast Asia became to some extent a sideshow, with various U.S. administrations often struggling to understand how to engage with this really diverse region absent a strategic prism. And the result, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, was episodic engagement, with some exceptions that I'll get to later. I would argue increased influence by Congress and some non-government institutions, and very much related to that, a growing tendency to calibrate our individual relationships with Southeast Asian countries based in large part on progress or lack thereof on democracy and human rights. During that period, we found it difficult to define what the purpose and benefits of our alliances were. And that led to up and down relations with Philippines, and I would say drift in the alliance with Thailand over a couple of decades. The exceptions, I would say, during this period were Vietnam and Singapore. Vietnam, because I think there was a need, an almost emotional need in the United States after the Vietnam War to deal with the domestic divisions and all the emotions surrounding that war. And because the end of the Cold War provided an opportunity to engage with Vietnam. And the Vietnamese worked really hard at it, to be fair, and they've worked very hard at the relationship ever since. The other exception in terms of steady engagement has been Singapore, because I think various administrations have recognized and appreciated its success, its strategic view. And again, like Vietnam, because Singapore works really hard in Washington to be, not always to agree with the United States, but to be a useful partner and an interlocutor. There were times during this period when the U.S. paid more attention to places like Indonesia and Myanmar as they were going through transitions. And that was because, A, Indonesia itself is so important because of its size, but because it was also going through this transition where it looked like it could even fall apart or become a democracy. And then Myanmar for almost sort of emotional reasons too, a strong desire to support the democracy movement there that continues to this day. And during all this time, I'd say Southeast Asia did well economically, but in recent years in particular, it's regressed on democracy and human rights. And it certainly struggled to be united and to stand up to Chinese assertiveness, particularly in the South China Sea. In the book, I argued that the rise of China has re-injected the strategic element into U.S. thinking vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. But the U.S. still calibrates the relationships based on democracy and human rights to a large extent, and has continued to engage kind of off and on. And has also overemphasized, in my view, the China angle rather than dealing with Southeast Asia on its own merits. So the result of all of this over the years has been some level of disappointment on both sides of the Pacific. But despite those disappointments, I think it's important to remember the relationships have brought big benefits for the United States, and I would argue for Southeast Asia, in terms of economic security, people-to-people ties, values, etc. And the rise of China highlights the importance of these relationships, and in my view, makes it both in the U.S. and in Southeast Asia's interest to strengthen the ties even more. And then this is, I think, the sort of tricky, nuanced point. Good U.S. relations with Southeast Asia help bolster the sovereignty and the freedom of maneuver of Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis China. But it's important to understand that the goal is not to turn them against China, which would be an effort in vain anyway, but again, to bolster their freedom of maneuver so they can make their own choices and aren't forced to accommodate China. And just an equally important point is, even if we have China in the back of our minds and Southeast Asians may as well, as we're engaging. The focus of U.S. dialogue and relationships with Southeast Asians shouldn't be China. That should stay in the back of our minds. The focus should be engaging with Southeast Asia on its own merits, because it is really important, and I would argue growing in importance, particularly economically. And if we were to engage with Southeast Asians talking about China all the time, as we've tended to do, then Southeast Asians feel like we're pressuring them to take sides, or that they ask, are we only talking to them because we're worried about China? So it's really counterproductive. So in a nutshell, what the United States should be doing is showing up at the presidential level on down consistently to build confidence in Southeast Asia that we're a partner they can rely on, to engage with a positive agenda that's based on Southeast Asia's merits as partners, to find a way to elevate our economic game, particularly on trade, which is obviously very difficult, as I said earlier, and not to make it about China. Don't talk about China. Now, obviously, there's going to be exceptions, but generally, we shouldn't be leading by talking about China. Focus on the younger generation. There's a lot of energy there, a lot of dynamism. Talk about education, health, climate, all these areas where we're already working. Focus on those. And continue to promote our values, but doing it with a lot more nuance and care than we sometimes do, keeping in mind that it's not the end of the Cold War anymore, and we don't have the ability to sort of coerce countries into doing what we hope they do on democracy and human rights. And last, the Southeast Asians also will need to do their part. It's not just on the U.S., and that means recognizing it's in their strategic interest to have good relations with the United States. Don't put the onus all on the U.S., and step up their efforts, their diplomatic efforts, and offer ideas and initiatives themselves. So let me stop with that and turn it back over to you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott, for that really comprehensive overview. I want to kind of start by delving into the chapter that you wrote on the Philippines. So in the book, you mentioned that the Philippines is your first posting. You wrote your thesis, your master's thesis about human rights in the Philippines. And as fate would have it, you ended up marrying a Filipina. So obviously, this is a country that you've been interested in for a very long time. And it was also surprising to me when I read it that you actually got a front row seat to the end of the Marcos regime at the palace at the height of the People Power movement back in the 1980s. But I think kind of what the broader chapter highlights and kind of what you point out very perceptively is that the foreign policy of the Philippines towards the U.S. seems to shift rather dramatically, and depending on who's in charge of the country, what political administration is in charge. But at its core, the Filipino people are still overwhelmingly supportive of the U.S. Of Americans. And so I think this kind of dynamic was brought to light very prominently during the transition between Noynoy Aquino back in 2016 and President Duterte, the so-called overture to China, the issue with the South China Sea Tribunal ruling. But with this past election and kind of the rise of Bongbong Marcos, there's many people, I think, in the U.S. that had a very staunchly anti-Marcos view. They wanted Leni Robredo. They wanted some other more, they wanted another candidate that didn't represent kind of the legacy of Marcos, because Marcos, for those who aren't aware, is the son of the former dictator. And so would he have these authoritarian tendencies? Would he kind of continue, or not continue, but be a bit more pro-Chinese in the foreign policy approach? But over the past year and a half, what we've seen is kind of the opposite of what the predictions held. So now the Philippines kind of revived the EDCA, the Defense Cooperation Agreement, and now arguably the U.S.-Philippines alliance, the U.S.-Philippines relationship is in a much better place than it was just 2 years ago. And so, Scott, my question for you is, what do you think of Bongbong Marcos Jr.'s performance as president right now? And were, US-based analysts wrong to be concerned about what his administration would mean for the future of the US-Philippines alliance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think where I would start is part of the challenge was for, from the end of the 80s, early 90s, for the next 20 years, I think both we and the Filipinos sort of struggled to figure out what's the purpose of this alliance with the end of the Cold War. There was a lot of US support for Philippine efforts against insurgencies and these sorts of things, but generally in Washington, the view of the Philippines was kind of the sick man of Asia, which frankly it was to a certain extent for some time. And I think there was some question in the Philippines too about what's the U.S. going to do for us? What's the value of the relationship? I think with Bongbong Marcos, certainly, he couldn't escape, at least initially, from sort of the legacy of his father and the family and all that went with that. And, of course, Americans don't get to vote in Philippine elections, which is, just the way the world works. I think, I'm not saying that sure it was wrong for analysts to be concerned, because there was a sense that even among, I think, a lot of Filipinos that Bongbong Marcos might be closer to China, maybe not as much as Duterte, but because of the family history with the U.S. and so on, may have some feelings about the U.S. and be more inclined to be pro-Chinese. And there was also concern that because his presidential election campaign honestly involved a whole lot of disinformation on social media, which I guess is the way politics works in a lot of places these days. So there were those concerns. But I think now what we've seen over the last year and a half is, I don't know what his intention was, what he had in his mind when he took office about the U.S. China. But frankly, the Chinese didn't really give him much choice, because for reasons I can't fathom, they decided that him taking office would be the time to up the pressure in the South China Sea, which elicited, and they've done that consistently for some time, which elicited, I think, a quite strong nationalist response in the public, and certainly would have encouraged, at a minimum, Marcos to take a tougher stance vis-a-vis China and lean more toward the United States. Maybe he would have anyway. I don't know. And I think the other thing he's done is he seems to have appointed competent technocrats to a lot of key positions, including in the economy. So I think it's been, for the most part, a more positive presidency than a lot of people had anticipated. We have to see, and there's certainly still some real issues there. And the relationship, as far as I can tell, is in a really good place. And the security relationships improved. The challenge now is to build on that, because you don't want it to swing again when we have a new president or they have a new president. And I think, to me, the key is building the economic relationship, which hasn't been bad, but it hasn't been as strong as it could be. But that stronger economic relationship provides a lot more ballast and helps keep the relationship healthy going forward.
Thanks, Scott. I guess to touch upon one of the points you made there. So I guess kind of a key policy, or not policy, but area for the U.S. to kind of work on is strengthening the economic relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. But I guess, what suggestions or recommendations would you have to go about doing that, given, sure, the Philippines is in Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that bilateral trade is relatively good, but what additional steps can we really take to, get the economic relationship to the next level, in your view?
Yeah, I think some of it is incumbent on the Philippines. One of the challenges there for a long time has been what's seen by a lot of people, a lot of American business people, is not a great investment environment. I know the Philippines is working to improve that, and the economy actually, at this point, last I saw a week or two ago, was actually looking pretty good. So that, I hope, will just naturally lead to more U.S. business interest and investment. When Bongbong Marcos visited the White House, President Biden talked about more work to support Philippines investments in the electric vehicle sector, which is, the batteries and what have you. So there's some opportunities there. I don't know what specifically they're going to do. And then I think continued dialogue between USTR and the Department of Trade in the Philippines over what other barriers are there to trade that we can ease without having to, do a formal trade agreement, which would be very difficult. So I think there's already some momentum. It's a matter of further dialogue, further discussions, trying to identify obstacles to either investment and trade.
Thanks, Scott. I think now let's move on to Thailand. So as you kind of mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it's a very timely time to hold it because the vote for the next Thai Prime Minister is forthcoming very shortly. For those of you who may not be aware, there was an election in Thailand very recently in May, which was kind of an upset win for the opposition. So both the Move Forward Party and the Pheu Thai Party, which are the two largest opposition parties in the country, won a landslide very unexpectedly against the incumbent junta regime. And so now there are kind of concerns, or I guess actually lawsuits that are going after the leader of Move Forward, PITA, Limjaroenrat, basically saying that he didn't have the legal standing to run in the election in the first place, and that all the MPs that he appointed potentially could be disqualified. And now there are, I guess, concerns about if PITA doesn't actually win on the first vote of in the Thai parliament, what exactly the reaction would be, both domestically and then from allies and partners of Thailand abroad. And so, Scott, I wanted to get your thoughts on this kind of dynamic. And kind of my first question is, what do you think is going to happen? Will PITA win on the first ballot? Are there concerns? Will the junta-appointed Senate actually get him over the top, respect the wishes of the Thai people? Or do you think we're in for another revolutionary type protest movement going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm hesitant to predict because last time I was asked to make a prediction about Thailand, I was on stage when I was in government with a colleague who predicted confidently in 2014 that there wouldn't be another coup. And then a few weeks later, there was a coup. So I don't know, but I think what we've seen going back really about the last 15 years or more is consistent, concerted efforts by, if you will, the conservative power base, whether it's elements within the monarchy, the military, the bureaucracy, etc., who have pretty consistently found ways, either through coups or judicial intervention, to disqualify candidates or even dissolve parties, to make sure that the conservatives, stayed in power. And everything I've read the last week or so suggests that a lot of people think that outcome is very likely, i.e., that perhaps the Constitutional Court, which agreed today to hear a couple of complaints about PITA, I think there's a decent likelihood that they will disqualify him. I can't say for sure, but that seems like a realistic outcome, unfortunately. And there's also, for those who don't know, the way that Thai system works after the 2014 coup with a new constitution, the parliament votes to elect a new prime minister, which is not unusual. But the parliament consists of the lower house, which is directly elected, but also the Senate, which was appointed basically by the Prime Minister Prayut and the military. And there's reason to, and PITA won enough seats in the lower house that he can put together a majority in the lower house, but without a significant number of votes, I think he needs 60 or 70 votes from the Senate, he can't win. And there's a lot of concern that the Senate just won't vote for him. then if he's disqualified or doesn't get the votes, then it's very unclear who would be next in line to at least try to get the prime ministership. You've already seen some protests. I think the bigger picture is the Thai people voted for change and reform. And like in a lot of Southeast Asia, the conservative elite is resisting. Exactly how that's going to play out over the next few days is hard to predict, other than it's pretty likely the conservative elite's going to continue to try to prevent the reformers from taking power. And there's a good chance if that happens that a lot of people go protest. So it's a really difficult and problematic situation. And it was significant ramifications, both for Thailand but also in the broader region. And certainly for U.S.-Thai relations, because the last point I would make is U.S.-Thai relations have been kind of drifting as we've struggled for reasons for the alliance to what's its purpose. But the polarization and the coups and what have you in Thailand over the last 15 years, and the U.S. criticism of those coups and other actions certainly has exacerbated that problem. And so it's going to be a very tricky situation for Thailand, and it's going to be very tricky for the U.S. administration to navigate through it as well.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, very difficult to predict at this stage. We'll just have to see how it ends up panning out. But I guess kind of a follow-up question to what you just said is that you're obviously right that perceptions of the U.S.-Thai alliance, both in Thailand and the U.S., is that it's in decline. You have, President Biden last year skipping the APEC ministerial meeting when he attended the other ASEAN-related and Southeast Asian-related summits in the region at the same time. And so I guess there's a perception, regardless of who actually ends up taking power, whether the conservative elites maintain their hold, whether PETA and the opposition kind of bring about change to Thailand. How best do you think we can strengthen the military alliance with Thailand, but then also cultural, economic engagement, and then how difficult do you think that will be if there's like a worst case scenario in this most recent vote for prime minister?
Right. Well, first, I think it's important for both the U.S. and the Thai to understand that the alliance, sort of the heyday of the alliance during the Vietnam War, that was kind of an anomaly. Thailand traditionally has been much more of a hedger or balancer. But because of the fear of communist expansion and the fact that they had communist forces right across the Mekong and their border in Laos, led them to align much more closely with us. So a certain amount of what's happened and them balancing back and building relations with China and others is in a lot of ways natural and not surprising, and not something that I don't think we should try to claw back the good old days. I mean, that was a different time. But I think there's still a lot of positives in the U.S.-Thai relationship. The business economic relationship is good. There's all kinds of amazingly good cooperation in areas like health, climate change, et cetera. Thailand's an enormously good partner for the United States and vice versa in these areas. There's still a close security relationship, Cobra Gold and much more. So there's a lot good. It's sort of the headlines have been fairly negative. And a lot of that particularly came after the 2014 coup, when we criticized it quite sharply, and the Thai barked back at us pretty strongly as well. And so some hard feelings. I would say that I would just note that President Biden's missing of APEC last year, I don't think that was an intentional slight on Thailand. I think that was just, he had something he had to be at and so on. But nonetheless, it fed that perception. So what to do? I'll get to the politics in Thailand in a second, but I think there's a lot of value in just discussions about the areas where we are working together and can work together more to strengthen those. And a lot of that's happening. the business ties, the health, the climate change. Hopefully with a new government, because there will be a new government, Thai foreign policy, which has been pretty muted lately. It used to be much more of a leader in mainland Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Maybe it will reassert itself. And I think there's a lot of value in us working with the Thai and at least coordinating with the Thai, communicating with the Thai on all kinds of issues, ranging from Mekong River to, building the economic ties in the Mekong subregion, all those sorts of things. And ideally even on Myanmar, although we're on different sides of that right now. Obviously, it would be much easier if the outcome of the Thai elections is one that we can say with a straight face reflected the will of the Thai people. If there's, for example, a judicial disqualification of PITA and a Move Forward party isn't able to get the prime ministership and there's big protests in Thailand, it'll be hard, it'll be impossible for the U.S. to sort of embrace the outcome. And I think this is really hard in Washington. This is, I think, where we just need to be very, very careful, because whatever we might think, we don't control what happens in Thailand. And so we'll have to strike a very careful balance between showing support for democracy and the voters of Thailand and being so critical that we drive whichever government emerges further away from us. It was hard to do when I was in government. It's hard to get it right. And there'll be tremendous pressure from various institutions in the US in and out of government to be really critical and to distance ourselves. But it depends a lot on what government emerges. If it's a government and a prime minister that emerges that's at least got a lot of votes and a lot of seats, that's a little bit different situation. But I think the challenge for the US will be not to surrender our values and kind of fail the Thai voters who would be disappointed if we just embrace the outcome, a negative outcome like that, but not to take it too far the other way.
Thanks, Scott. That's really really helpful. I think one point I wanted to bring up is you said that Thai diplomacy had been rather muted recently, but I think in the Myanmar case specifically, it's been quite robust, kind of sidestepping ASEAN. The deputy Thai foreign minister recently meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi, the first official to meet with her since she's been detained after the coup. And so I think we can discuss that in further detail when we get to Myanmar. But I guess to move on to Vietnam. So I think the chapter that you wrote on Vietnam, obviously for those who aren't aware, Scott was the first U.S. diplomat that was posted in Vietnam after the end of the Vietnam War. And one aspect of the chapter that was quite funny was that you were actually the one that picked the building in which the embassy would be based, and that you're still getting a lot of flack for it among your State Department colleagues even today. But I guess that kind of leads to the question. So, you selected this building, but did you have any inkling, back when you were posted there at the very beginning, that the U.S.-Vietnam relationship would transform so positively in the way that it has over the past 30 years? I think it's because I think the transformation, former enemies to now very not, comprehensive strategic partners, but almost pretty robust allies as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. So, I mean, what do you think contributed to this rejuvenation of the relationship? What exactly did the U.S. Do right? And maybe you can speak a little bit about your on the ground experience, kind of give a tease of kind of what you talk about in the book while you were on the ground back in the early period.
Yeah, I wish I could say I was prescient and forecast all of this, but no, I think, we certainly saw potential for an improved and pretty good relationship, but I don't think I would have predicted that it would have gone as well as it has over the last 30 years. It was 30 years next month that I showed up in Hanoi to open the State Department office. So why has it succeeded? I think there's a handful of reasons. One is, if all you have to do is look at Iran to see that former enemies, it's not inevitable that you make up and build a new relationship. And the Iranian Revolution was only 4 years after the fall of Saigon. So I think it's an interesting comparison. The Vietnamese at the end of the Cold War, they'd relied on the Soviet Union. They had a lot of reasons, diplomatic, strategic, economic, to want to diversify their relationships, and having access to the U.S. market and a relationship with the U.S. was really important. We had a lot of internal reasons, maybe less strategic and more the heal the wounds of the war, the divisions that the war had caused within the United States, some business interests as well. And I think that got us going. And interestingly, working on the legacies of the war, the accounting for missing Americans, and later things like Agent Orange and unexploded munitions contributed, and what I think was essential. I don't think the relationship could have developed as much as it did if both sides hadn't worked together on those things. But I think once the relationship was normalized, what really has driven it more than anything else is the trade and business relationship. Vietnam's now, I think I just heard the other day, our 9th or 10th largest trading partner in the world. It's a huge economic relationship. And that, I think, has really driven it. That's sort of led the way. And then over time, again, dealing with Agent Orange and accounting for missing Americans and all these things contributed. Gradual building education ties. There's a huge number of Vietnamese students in the United States. And later, security and strategic concerns. I don't think they were key early on. Maybe they were for the Vietnamese, but not for us. But certainly the concerns in Vietnam about China has certainly encouraged the Vietnamese to continue to build the relationship, and we've been happy to do that as well. And last but not least, when I went to Vietnam, someone said, the Vietnamese are a lot like us. And I didn't quite get what they meant, but I see some of that in the sense that of all the Southeast Asian governments that I've dealt with, and maybe setting Singapore aside, the Vietnamese are maybe the most sort of pragmatic and results oriented. Like, oh, let's get this done. I'm not saying the other governments don't want to get things done. Don't get me wrong, but Vietnamese are actually relatively effective. And you can, when you say, hey, let's talk trade, they'll look for progress and results as much as we will. And it tends to be very pragmatic. U.S. senior officials who go to Vietnam tend to find their meetings productive and useful. And sometimes when you travel to other countries in Southeast Asia, those meetings are just as important, but they don't always produce the quick outcomes that people in Washington seem to like. Notice how I say people in Washington like I was never one of them. So I think all those factors, but I think the business and more recently the strategic ties have been critical.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of to build upon that, now that the commercial relationship is so strong, the strategic alignment is very clear against China and South China Sea and various other aspects of the relationship. What do you think are kind of the remaining roadblocks to working with the Vietnamese at this stage? So obviously, it's still controlled by a communist government. We do have the human rights dialogue that the State Department implemented a number of years ago, but I think there is trepidation to not raise the ideology question, the human rights democracy question too much, because I mean, that's partially why we fought the Vietnam War in the first place, right? Was this question over ideology. And so how do you think we kind of push the relationship forward, make it stronger, while kind of not necessarily sidestepping, but still addressing these kind of ideology concerns?
Well, as I've argued in the book, that the human rights issue and to a certain extent the democracy issue has been an irritant. It's been a drag on the relationship from both sides. I think we have not hesitated to raise human rights concerns. We've done it consistently, and with limited results. Sometimes you get somebody out of prison or maybe some improvement in religious freedom here and there. But I think people in the United States understand we're not going to change the fundamental system. I mean, that's up to the Vietnamese. So, and the Vietnamese obviously aren't thrilled when we raise those, but they tend to be pragmatic about it. And on the Vietnamese side, there's still skeptics and suspicions, particularly in the party and the security apparatus toward the United States. It still lingers. So those limit the relationship to a certain extent. The other thing is sometimes there's a tendency for people to look at the trajectory of the last 30 years and just assume it's going to continue. But, the Vietnamese, I think, are going to be very careful not to let the relationship reach the point that it really causes problems with Beijing. And moving in any kind of alliance direction, for example, would do that. They've got a long history with China. There's a wariness about China, but there's also some ideological kinship and just practically a recognition that they need to keep China reasonably happy or not overly concerned about how far they've gone with the U.S. So I think all those factors set some limits on it, but there's still plenty of room for growth and development within those limits.
Thanks, Scott. That's a great answer. Moving on to Cambodia. So I think I'm going to keep the point on Cambodia to around maybe one question, but I think the big flashpoint, at least in my eyes right now, in the Cambodian context, is the political transition between Hun Sen and his son, Hun Manet. I mean, how do you think U.S. foreign policy or Cambodian policy towards the U.S. will change, if any, through this transition? And what can we kind of expect from the upcoming election in Cambodia this summer?
Yeah, as you saw in my chapter on Cambodia, I think a lot of the U.S. frustration with Cambodia is, we poured our heart and soul, and as did many other countries, into the Cambodian peace process back in, leading into the 1991 peace agreement in Paris. And I think with the hope and expectation that would produce democracy. And to put it, maybe oversimplify, Hun Sen spoiled that by sort of making sure that he was in charge. And for many years, there was still a fair amount of democratic space, even though there were obviously problems. But in recent years, he's really tightened up and suppressed the opposition that much more, which has created a lot of unhappiness in Washington for understandable reasons. The transition to Hun Manet, I mean, it's hard to say. I've met Hun Manet a couple of times, but I wouldn't try to predict based on that what he's going to do. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say you will see a lot of continuity from Cambodia. My guess is Dad will still be kind of behind the scenes, providing helpful advice to Hun Manet. And the U.S. will probably kind of keep on going where it has been, which is, being pretty critical. But I hope, because, again, I'm going to shift back to the Philippines. Forgive the analogy, but when Noynoy Aquino was elected, what was that, 2010, 11? I can't remember now. People sort of looked at him and well, he's his mother's son, so he's going to be like this. And then Bongbong Marcos, he's his father's son, he's going to be like this. So I don't think we know what Hun Manet's going to be. I do think, again, Dad will be supervising to a certain extent for some time. But I would hope that the U.S. would continue to engage with him and the government because there's actual work to be done with the government. And also, just in case over time things adjust somewhat. I'm not predicting some dramatic transformation, but you never know when there may be some change here and there. And so it's important to be there and engaging as much as possible. But without unrealistic expectations.
Thanks, Scott. I guess the follow-up question first, if you could maybe touch upon kind of the implications of the election a little bit, and then
I mean, it sounds like Hun Sen and the CPP have basically just completely defanged the opposition. So it's just not much of you had some competitive elections several years ago, but by all, it certainly looks at this point like these are not going to be serious elections, and certainly not going to be very competitive. It's a very, very not level playing field.
Yeah, I'm also curious too if you could maybe expound a few thoughts on kind of why Hun Sen chose now to kind of do this political transition, because he's not that old yet. He could have stayed in power for another,
Yeah,
5 to 6 years. But
it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, we don't know what his health situation is. I mean, I'm not implying, I don't have any information, so I'm not
yeah,
suggesting something. Or maybe he said, while I'm strong and really in charge, this is the best time to do it, and that gives me some years to kind of be mentoring him, rather than waiting till I'm maybe frail. And because what little I've read on this suggests that there is some opposition to Hun-Manet and a CPP. So, Hun Sen may want to have a period where he can kind of help Hun-Manet navigate through that.
absolutely makes sense. Moving on, so I guess the last two countries where you served as ambassador, Indonesia and Myanmar. First, starting with Indonesia. So there's some really interesting anecdotes in the book, from doing karaoke with a few Indonesian officials to witnessing the political rise of the current president. But I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on, having served there kind of at the height of the U.S. Indonesia relationship in 2010, 2013. Kind of Indonesia is very, very important, arguably the most important Southeast Asian state, given that its population is so huge, its economy is very sizable, and that it's really, I guess you could say, the only ASEAN country that can kind of throw its weight around within the organization. And so my question is, what do you think about kind of the current approach of Jokowi and his foreign policy towards both the U.S. and China, and kind of how does Indonesia see its position given its prominence within ASEAN? Is it want to maintain this, ASEAN centrality? Does it want to take a more aggressive role? I think there's some hopes, especially with respect to the situation in Myanmar, that perhaps Indonesia could pull some strings and maybe get some progress. But so far, it seemed like that hasn't necessarily panned out to be the case. So I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing for me to think when I think about Indonesia is to understand that, the non-aligned mentality is deeply rooted in the Indonesian psyche. And this free and active foreign policy, and as you said, it's the one Southeast Asian country with the mass in terms of population size, et cetera, to really hold to that and not be pushed or cajoled into leaning toward one country or the other. So I think it's very non-aligned, very proud country, and for what I see with President Jokowi, and I admire Jokowi. I knew him when he was mayor of Solo and governor of Jokowi, and I thought he did a lot of good things. There's criticism of him as president, but that kind of goes with the territory. What I see, people say, oh, Indonesia is moving too close to China. Well, first of all, that's Indonesia's decision. Right. I mean, that's one of the things we have to understand is countries get to decide, governments get to decide how close they want to be with other governments. It's not up to us to tell them. Second, my sense of from knowing Jokowi some personally is that, he's not anti-American. I don't know that he's particularly pro-Chinese inherently, but he's all about building. He's all about economic development, infrastructure, et cetera. And he views foreign policy, I think that his record shows that he views foreign policy in part as, how can I work with partners to get them to contribute to what I'm trying to build here? And China's been able and willing to contribute more than the United States has on that front, particularly on infrastructure. And so he does a lot with China. So I think that's just the reality. I think sometimes people worry a little too much about that. Indonesia, again, is a big, strong country, and it's not going to become a vassal state of anybody. And if we would like Indonesia to do more with us, then let's do stuff. Let's do something. And we have a great opportunity with this $20 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership, which we in Japan led the G7 to sign with Indonesia last November, which is an opportunity to contribute to help Indonesia make this transition from coal to cleaner energy. And implementing that reasonably successfully would be good for climate change, good for the environment, for Indonesia, but also would show the U.S. actually delivering on something. It's not all on the U.S., it's the G7 plus Norway and Denmark, but that's a great opportunity. And the relationship with Indonesia is still good. We just had big military exercises with Indonesia. The economic relationship has lagged a little bit, and I think that's the area really to work on.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, so you mentioned the G7 and kind of cooperation around climate change. I'm kind of curious, what did you think of Indonesia's chairmanship of the G20, and kind of how they position themselves? I mean, there was a few controversies over kind of Russia-Ukraine issues, but what did you think of their performance overall?
I think they did pretty well, and it was a really difficult situation with Russia, Ukraine. The Indonesians are almost always going to be in favor of inclusion. They're not big on excluding countries that are behaving badly. In that case, the Myanmar junta is a sort of an exception. But I think the final G20 statement turned out, I think people were pretty happy with that. So I think it was an example of good Indonesian diplomacy in the end.
Thanks, Scott. And then I guess the final question on Indonesia, maybe a bit of a more tongue-in-cheek one. What are your thoughts on the relocation of the capital from Jakarta to Nusantara? Do you think it's going to attract long-term investment? Do you think it's a strategic move that will be in the long term beneficial for Indonesia, or is it kind of
it's a bold move. Moving the capital is probably necessary. I mean, Jakarta is sinking and overwhelmed. So it's either a bold visionary move that we'll all look back in 30 years and say, wow, or we'll look back and say, what a huge white elephant. We just don't know. Implementation will be key. They're getting some investment, certainly from the United Arab Emirates, which has a really good relationship with Indonesia and some others. I know there are lots of skeptics. Maybe they'll be right. I just don't know. But my argument would be, if you don't like this move, what do you suggest? Because, when Jokowi became governor, when Jokowi became governor, there was a desperate need for mass transit in Jakarta. And there must have been 20 or 30 different studies that had been done on how to do it, and it all sat on various shelves for years. Jokowi went in and did it. He's a doer. Now, I think there's arguably a need to move the capital. Whether Nusantara and East Kalimantan is the right place to do it, whether it's being done in a way that's actually going to work, that's a different question. And I know there's some questions about that. But I applaud the boldness. I just hope they can pull it off, but I don't know.
Well, I for one very much hope they do, because I for one like to see less traffic in Jakarta. Going forward. Thanks, Scott. So moving on to Myanmar. So having read the Myanmar chapter, I think really, really fascinating as someone who works on Myanmar quite closely. But I kind of want to hone in on the latter half of your time working on the country when you were U.S. Ambassador, and then kind of in the aftermath of the Rohingya genocide, the Rohingya crisis back in 2016, back in 2017, with a mass exodus into Bangladesh. So obviously, Aung San Suu Kyi's, the civilian government of Myanmar's defense of kind of what happened of the military when she went to The Hague, the International Court of Justice, basically defended the military. She kind of became, this disgraced Nobel laureate, persona non grata in Washington and Europe, elsewhere. However, now that I guess her administration is gone and the junta is back in power, where exactly do you think the United States should go from here? So obviously you've written in the past about, more robustly supporting the national unity government, the opposition. But I guess how far do you think we should necessarily go? So obviously the Burma Act, the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed in the Congress gives the congressional authority to the US to give arms and humanitarian aid to resistance. But do you think is that a step too far? Or, I mean, because if nothing is done, I mean, the situation is just going to keep ballooning into crisis after crisis as it has for the past 70 years or so. So what do you think the US approach should be post-coup?
Good question. First, a word on the Rohingya crisis, because it is so important. It's important to a couple of key points. One, and some of this is being, revisionist history is going on, even among some of my Myanmar friends about what happened. But the military carried out this horrific military operation in response to an attack by ARSA, a small group of Rohingya. So they had a legitimate reason to respond to that attack. But of course, what the military did is engaged in a wildly disproportionate response that resulted in thousands of deaths, all kinds of horrors, and 700,000 to 800,000 people being forced out of the country, whether their villages were burnt. What's not talked about as much these days in Myanmar is that I don't think the civilian government was behind that or necessarily condoned the brutality, but there was tremendous anti-Rohingya sentiment throughout the country. Very few people stood up for the Rohingya. Now, whether they just believed the propaganda or there were deeper issues, you can argue. But that was a really ugly period, and one where I think Aung San Suu Kyi failed to use her immense popularity to offer a different path to the country. I don't think she could have stopped the military, but she could have led the country in a much different direction in terms of attitudes. Okay, set that aside. Now, I mean, I think there's a lot of troubling things about what's been happening, but one of the troubling things is some of the people, even in ASEAN, with all due respect, still are continuing to treat this as if it's sort of a coup and now a civil war between rival factions. It's not. There was a national election in November 2020 in which the NLD, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won overwhelmingly. There's no question about it. This was not a fraudulent election or anything like that. And the military wanted power back, and they came in and took it. And then when people protested, they just started killing them, and they haven't stopped killing them. And so people in the end took up arms. So this is a national uprising against a military that's absolutely hated and is the worst regime in Southeast Asia since the Khmer Rouge. They're everything that you see that what Russia's been doing in Ukraine, the Myanmar military has been doing the same, if not worse, to its own people in Myanmar. The military has no ability to govern the country, to restore stability, or to run the country in any kind of reasoned way. What we're seeing is that people who'd lived under military rule for years and decades and saw how badly the Myanmar military ran the country, then had a taste of significant freedom and opportunity for a decade. They see it all taken away. And so they're fighting to get back their freedom and their opportunity again. And I don't think they're going to stop. The ASEAN 5-point consensus isn't going to go anywhere. Because the generals just won't listen to him, and because it's kind of based on the fallacy that what's needed is some kind of dialogue between the military and the resistance. There's no deal to be cut here. The military wants to stay in power and is willing to kill as many people as it needs to stay in power. And the people/resistance want the military out of power. And people say, well, some kind of compromise. Well, they did the compromise from 2010 to 2020, where the military retained tremendous power alongside a civilian government. That didn't work. So this is kind of a zero-sum game, sadly, at least at this point, at least until the military is weakened sufficiently to the point that the generals look for a way out. So I don't think ASEAN can fix this. I mean, with all due respect to Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, whom I know well and have great admiration for, you know, this dialogue to try to get them to talk to each other, it's not going to go anywhere. And I don't blame ASEAN too much, because I don't think ASEAN has it within its power to compel the military to change course. I think the U.S. should very much be on the side of wanting the resistance to win, realizing there's risks associated with that, because even though it's the different ethnic communities have lots of issues of trust and fractiousness, they're moving in the right direction. So there's risks associated with a resistance win, but much greater, I mean, certainty if they don't win, if this continues, that, as you said, you're looking at a Syria-like situation, or decades of or years of military rule, both of which would be awful. So I think the U.S. is on the right path. I would like to see a little bit more energy and resources put behind it. Arming the resistance is tricky for a couple of reasons. One, there's the moral argument. You can argue that back and forth each way. There's the argument that how do you even get weapons in when all of the neighbors are sort of supporting the junta? And third, there's the risk that if you do that, the Chinese, who are already nervous about our rhetorical and other support for the resistance, will see this increasingly as a U.S.-China battleground, which it shouldn't be, and would respond by bolstering aid to the junta. So I think the U.S. should be providing more financial assistance to the resistance, NUG, but also others, more money for training, and should be continuing to squeeze the junta in every way possible in coordination with resistance. There may be opportunities to provide communications and other equipment that could help the resistance that's non-lethal. Ways that would help the resistance be able to respond, or at least avoid the air attacks that the military is relying on, killing large numbers of civilians. So I think I would be in favor of more financial aid and non-lethal aid. Lethal aid, I'm torn on. I see the obvious reasons to do it and the obvious reasons not to do it. It's a really tough one.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, to kind of expand on one of the points you made about all neighbors of Myanmar being pro-junta, I was quite surprised recently to see in the joint statement from President Biden and Prime Minister Modi, when he came to the White House, that they were, I guess, calling for action on Myanmar. And then also you see, and as we kind of discussed earlier on during the webinar, this kind of subnational diplomacy from Thailand, kind of sidestepping ASEAN, meeting with different officials in the government. So I guess my question is, could you foresee either India or Thailand changing their position on being pro-junta anytime in the near future?
I wish I could see it in India. I think the Indians know their interests better than I do. So I have to, say this with some caution, but I think they're being short-sighted. They're worried about losing Myanmar to Chinese influence. And so they're supporting the junta, which, if the junta wins, good for India. Sorry to say. But if the junta doesn't win, I think the Myanmar people are going to remember whose side India was on. And unlike China, with which Myanmar has to have a good relationship, Myanmar can kind of ignore India to a certain extent. India is just not as important to them economically or otherwise. So I think India is taking a risk, and I think I hope they will look for a different strategy, but I'm not predicting that. With Thailand, I think a lot will depend on what the new government, who's in, who's not. I have to say, the Thai government under Prime Minister Prayut and Foreign Minister Don has been extraordinarily unhelpful on the humanitarian side, on dealing with people who've had to flee across the border, but mostly by supporting the junta so blatantly and openly, and in my view, undermining Indonesia's chairmanship and ASEAN centrality as a whole by kind of going off on their own in contradiction to ASEAN's stated policy and meeting regularly with the junta and encouraging endorsement and engagement with the junta. And as you probably saw overnight, Foreign Minister Don said in his latest trip to Naypyidaw just a few days ago that he met with Aung San Suu Kyi, and that he then conveyed what he said she said. And I think that was really problematic. The National Unity Government Foreign Minister Zin Marong in an interview blasted the foreign minister for doing that, saying he's making a mess of things. So we'll just have to wait and see what the new Thai government does. But I think there's a relationship. I don't know if it's personal with Prayut and Min Aung Hlaing, the leader of the junta, but certainly among senior Thai military officials. But I don't see that it's in Thailand's interest for this brutal junta that cannot govern and restore stability to be in power for a long time. And it's certainly not in their interest for this ongoing conflict to continue.
Thanks, Scott. I guess moving on to the final part of our conversation, which is kind of touching upon how you think the U.S. Can up its game in Southeast Asia more broadly. Of course, the title of your book is Imperfect Partners, and you kind of go on to explain that the reason you named it that is because conversations about U.S. ties with Southeast Asia often highlight the imperfections and disappointments that the other sees in the partner. So from the U.S. side, democracy and human rights closest to China, but in the region, the lack of commitment, lack of reliability. Can you count on the U.S. to even show up? But with that said, I think one of the key themes that kind of strung across all of the different countries that you talk about in the book, and then we talked about during the webinar, is that kind of strengthening the economic piece of the U.S. relationship with Southeast Asia and with ASEAN. And so obviously when the Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was a big blow to America's economic statecraft in the region. And so my question is, do you think that what the Biden administration is doing through IPEF, through these kind of more bilateral trade negotiations, is really sufficient to kind of to whet the appetite of ASEAN member states? Or do you think it will kind of require a longer term rethink of economic policy towards the Indo-Pacific more broadly?
Yeah, well, the reality is, I mean, a couple of things. First, I think despite all the disappointments, the U.S. relationships in Southeast Asia are overall still pretty good. I think, as you pointed out, the two areas where we've, I think, struggled the most is one, gaining the trust and confidence of the countries of Southeast Asia that we're going to be there long term. So we showed up a lot during the Obama administration, didn't show up during the Trump administration, showing up during the Biden administration. So Southeast Asia, I want to say, okay, what happens after 2024? So somehow we need to find a way to show up at from the president on down consistently to build that confidence. Second, on the economics, no, I don't think IPEF is sufficient. Maybe it'll surprise on the upside, but at this point, I don't think. It seems to be what the political domestic political situation in Washington will tolerate for now. So we got to make the most of it and try to put meat on the bones of it. But we shouldn't be under the illusion that it's going to suffice long term. And saying, well, telling the Southeast Asians, well, we'd love to, but we can't because our domestic politics gets in the way. Well, that's an excuse nobody's going to buy. It's like, that's not our problem if you're in Southeast Asia. It's like, China's here and Japan's here and others. So if you guys can't play, you can't play. then that's not our problem. That's your problem. So we need to, what I know it's not easy, but if we're as concerned as we say we are about China's influence, then we need to understand that to maintain our own influence, we gotta up our economic game. If we don't, and that means trade, we lose influence, period. You can't have both. So you gotta make it clear that our strategic interests are inseparable from our economic and trade policy. And as you said, the TPP withdrawal by President Trump was, just a disaster economically, but more importantly, strategically. It would have locked us into the region for many, many years. So very unfortunate.
Thanks, Scott. I guess to hop on to the next question, which I think is about how do we build up the pipeline of especially young American professionals to both gain firsthand experience in Southeast Asia and then kind of get an interest in actually working on the country and kind of developing expertise. I think it's one of the key points that you kind of outlined at the very beginning of the book was that there aren't that many people that have a lot of knowledge on the region just because it's so diverse, so many different religions, so many different cultures, so huge, right? So many different countries, but and so you have kind of exchange programs, kind of like the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, the State Department. You have this new Rising Leaders program. It's administered through Johns Hopkins SAIS that was announced after the U.S. ASEAN summit. But these are mostly focusing on, kind of bringing in either, early or mid-career Southeast Asians to the U.S., but there's no really U.S. to Southeast Asia. So, I mean, how do you think we can address that gap going forward?
Yeah, it is a real challenge. I mean, part of the reason I wrote my book and that I hope it is of some value is when I was doing research for it, there's so little in terms of books that have been written on U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. You can find the occasional book on U.S. relations with a particular country, or you can, there's just not much. And so there's a scholarship issue, and Southeast Asian studies is pretty limited in the United States. I guess it's a funding issue primarily, but more and more universities are actually shutting their Southeast Asian studies program. And I don't think the U.S. government necessarily can fix that. I'm not sure. I think what may drive it is the business community, because from what I hear, there's more and more interest in the business community in Southeast Asia as companies are looking to, shift from China to China plus one, or diversifying supply chains, that sort of thing. You have, Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries collectively are already the 5th largest economy in the world, averaging 5.5% growth over many years. So I think we're seeing more and more business interest, and like the old saying goes, follow the money. So it may be the business side of thing as much as anything else that drives it. And I'm sure there are other things that, scholarships and more exchange programs would be good. But I'm not sure there's one easy answer. And when I look at universities and think tanks, it's money.
Yeah.
Or lack of money.
Thanks, Scott. So I think we touched upon a really wide-ranging amount of points, covered a lot of ground and countries. And so I kind of want to open it up now to the questions from the audience. And so I think I'll start with the first one that was posed by Vivian NG in the chat. And she asks, many countries in Southeast Asia do not have the kind of democratic regimes advocated by the U.S. How does the U.S. convince its own people that Southeast Asian countries remain important as partners and the regime should continue to be supported, even if they have less than impressive track records with respect to democracy, other than their importance as partners against Chinese assertiveness in the region? I guess you can briefly address this earlier, but You could kind of expand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly convincing the U.S. people, but it's also convincing people in Congress and so on that, I think the U.S. support and advocacy for human rights and democracy is an asset. And I think a lot of people in Southeast Asia appreciate it. It's sort of how we do it. And recognizing that, again, we don't get to decide what they do. And I think what's important is to continue to engage even when things aren't going as well as we would like on the democracy and human rights front. That doesn't mean we always do business as usual. If there's a coup, we don't invite the coup leader to the White House the next day, that kind of thing. Don't get me wrong. But continuing to engage and just making the point that, the U.S. isn't the world's policeman. It never was, but it's even less so than it ever might have been. And that the way to promote democracy and human rights is through a lot more nuance, starting with setting a good example with how we run our own democracy. And that, it's in the U.S. interest to continue to work with countries. And because when we're working with countries, we're not just working with governments. A lot of our work overseas with other countries, as you know, is not with the governments. It's with NGOs, it's with opposition parties, it's with the independent media, all these sorts of things. So I think we could do a better job of highlighting that, oh, we're working with country X, they've got a bad human rights record. Yeah, but we're not funneling lots of money to the government. We almost never do that. We're supporting, sectors and communities in the country that are trying to move in a positive direction. And we just need to sort of say that, push back a little bit on the sort of demand that when things don't go our way, we don't talk to the relevant regime. I would make an exception for the Myanmar junta because they're so far beyond the pale and because talking to them has proven to be a complete waste of time in the past. I say from personal experience. But that's the exception rather than the rule.
Thanks, Scott. Our next question comes from Georgi Mamashashvili, who asks, what role does the U.S. military presence play in supporting the Philippines' efforts in safeguarding its maritime interests in the South China Sea?
Well, I would say it's not just for the Philippines, but in the region as a whole. A couple. One is our Navy continues to do freedom of navigation operations, which basically means we sail in international waters with our Navy, even in areas of those international waters that say China claims. And we feel very strongly that we're justified under international law, that these are international waters that anyone can sail through. So by sailing through these waters, we're sort of setting the precedent that no country has the right to shut off passage through these waters, and that should help everybody. That's one. Two is boosting the capacity, the capability of the Philippines, Vietnam, others to patrol and have visibility in their own maritime space. Not suggesting that they go out and start fighting against the Chinese, but what happens a lot is Chinese ships will be all over, in Philippine exclusive economic zone or Vietnam's. If the Philippines doesn't have the vessels to even be out there, they can't counter that presence. And when I say counter, again, I don't mean with conflict. And they don't even know what's going on. So helping them have a better sense of an ability to manage and patrol their own areas is a second point, and supporting them in fora like the ASEAN Regional Forum and so on, talking about these things. And then in the Philippines with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, basically means U.S. military gets access with Philippine approval to certain Philippine bases, but they're still Philippine bases. But in return, we're investing money in upgrading those bases, which boosts their capability.
Thanks, Scott. Hope that answers your question, Georgie. Our next question is from Susie Isa Nataliwati, who says, one of Indonesia's big problems nowadays is religious radicalism as a result of transnational Islam. U.S. policy in the Middle East considered as one factor that influenced the movement. In the wake of Saudi Arabia's ongoing changes, what do you think that the U.S. can do to help Indonesia with respect to this matter? And I think you actually mentioned in the book that Southeast Asia could have become the next war on terror, right? But it didn't actually end up being the case.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's true. This is a really important and difficult question. And my view may be in the minority. I think the United States should not be doing very much. Here's why. If the U.S. goes in and tries to play a role in the discussion of Islam, the proper role of Islam, and so on in Indonesia, will generate an enormous backlash, and we will tar anyone we're associated with in the process. There is a very long and consistent record in Indonesia of Indonesians speaking up for tolerance and pluralism and peace and all of these sorts of things. So we just get in the way and actually make things worse if we meddle. And Indonesians, like most foreign countries, are very sensitive to U.S. meddling. Now, the one exception, and I don't know the latest, but at least when I was there, providing some limited support to help the Indonesian law enforcement authorities go after terrorists. I'm talking about terrorists here. I'm not talking about, people who may have a different view of Islam than we do, or more pious than some people might feel comfortable with. That's a different issue. I'm talking about terrorists, and they're providing some training and that kind of technical support, I think, is in a very tactical way, it can be helpful. And as you noted, as the questioner noted, I mean, one of Indonesia's complaints and people's complaints is our Middle East policy and our what they see as our unwavering support for Israel vis-a-vis Palestine. I'm not going to wade into that one because it's beyond my writ, but it is a reality. But I think it's much more an internal Indonesian discussion and debate about Islam that's been going on for a long time. And again, I think encouraging open dialogue about it is about as far as we can go, but we shouldn't get in the middle of it.
Thanks, Scott. Our next question comes from Michael Kachelski, who says, thanks for the excellent presentation. Your point about us focusing on the Southeast Asian countries in their own light rather than primarily in the context of China is valid, but all the more difficult given the fact that China is a central issue in the upcoming U.S. election campaign. To follow up on a previous question, how might we encourage that valid U.S. focus on the countries themselves, which is a challenge for U.S. policies vis-a-vis other countries as well, as rather than in the Chinese context? And then on a separate point, in your analysis on U.S. relations with Southeast Asian countries, how much do you discuss the role of Philippine Americans, Vietnamese Americans in particular?
Well, thank you. Okay. All honesty, Michael is a longtime friend. We served in the Philippines together on our first tour back in the mid 1980s, and he most recently was our ambassador to Mongolia. So, Michael, great to hear from you. Glad you could join this. Yeah, you make a really good point about how do we talk about these issues in Southeast Asia in a political environment in the U.S. where everyone's racing to show how tough they are on China and everything's about China. I don't know that there's an easy answer other than telling the truth, which is saying these countries are really important in their own right, and they're going to respond much better to us if we don't go lecture them about China and nag them about China all the time, but rather build the kind of relationship with them that's a good, healthy relationship. I don't know how far that's going to fly. That's why I'm not a politician, because it is, really problematic in our current political environment. On your second question, it's a really good question. The truth is, I didn't really discuss the role of Philippine Americans or Vietnamese Americans much in the book. I think the only time I addressed it was talking about normalization with Vietnam at a time when significant parts of the Vietnamese American community were strongly opposed to normalization. But otherwise, I didn't really get into that, although it's a very good question.
Thanks, Scott. So I think we have time for one more question before I close out the webinar. And that is a question of my own, which is, I think, a central theme you kind of raise in the book is kind of harnessing the power of Southeast Asia's youth, especially in relation to, digital economy, in relation to its potential for political change, growing business ties between the U.S. and different Southeast Asian countries. And so are there any particular recommendations that you have for kind of increasing focus on youth communities outside of like exchange programs or things of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I'm, and this may be true everywhere in the world, not only in Southeast Asia, but I've always been so impressed with the younger generations in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and in Myanmar and Vietnam, all these places, just really dynamic people who are anxious for the country to move ahead and very dedicated to their communities. And they often run up against, sort of a more conservative elite that holds on to power. That's not surprising. I think we do engage with younger people in the region a lot. I think what I would say, more scholarships. Our higher education system is one of our greatest assets. And it's, I know scholarships are expensive, but you sending someone or allowing someone to come study in the United States at one of our universities not only equips them really well and gives them a great experience that they can go back and make a mark in their own country, but in my experience makes them friends for life. Doesn't mean they'll always agree with us, but they're friends for life. So more scholarships, more exchange programs. We underfund these programs. They're worth their weight in gold. Second, I think there's some interesting things we could do in the tech and startup realm. There's a program that some of you may have heard of that President Obama started called YCAPS, the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, in which young Southeast Asians sort of self-identified as future leaders. Okay. And we organized all kinds of events for them, mostly in their own countries, but getting them together, sometimes bringing them to the U.S., meeting with U.S. counterparts. I think we could do the same focused on entrepreneurship and startups. And it's not a huge amount of money. And a lot of young people in the U.S. and in Southeast Asia look up to the U.S. for the innovation, the education, all of these sorts of things. So I think it's an asset we can do more with.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I think with that, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank both Ambassador Marciel and all of you for tuning into the webinar this morning or evening, depending if you're in Japan or the U.S. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to paste the link again to Scott's book. Having read it over the past several weeks or so, that's highly recommended. I have it right here. I don't know if you can see it with my Zoom background, but it is a really fascinating read. And I hope those of you who tune in today found the conversation about U.S. relations with Southeast Asia fascinating. And so with that, thank you once again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you at future YCAPS events. We do have a number of events coming up, and you can check these out at ycaps.org. They'll be on the homepage. So thank you so much again, and Ambassador Marciel and everyone, and take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.